Welcome back to Tartan Lullaby. I'm Archie, and tonight there's a long, quiet story waiting for you. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find your pillow. Soften your shoulders. Let the day go. Tartan Lullaby tells slow stories of Scotland. Real places, real years, real people, told gently enough to fall asleep inside. There's no music tonight, and no need to follow every word. If you drift off in the first few minutes, the rest will play on quietly without you. That's how it's meant to be. If these stories are a quiet corner you find yourself returning to, a subscription would mean a great deal, and it helps us keep making them. The artwork you see throughout tonight's story is available as a print in our Etsy shop, if you'd like to bring a little of Scotland onto your walls. When you're ready, close your eyes and we'll begin. Tonight, North Berwick, East Lothian, 1590. Witch Trials of North Berwick. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. The tide is going out. You can hear it before you can see anything. The pull of water over stone, the small collapse of a wave onto the harbour sand, and then the long drag back. North Berwick Harbour faces north into the Firth of Forth, and in the hour before dawn in the autumn of 1590, the Firth is a flat, dark presence beyond the harbour mouth. There is no colour in it yet, just mass and sound and the cold smell of salt and weed. The harbour itself is small. It has been here in some form since the 12th century, serving the borough that grew along the low ridge behind it. By 1590, the stone pier runs out to the east, curving slightly, offering what shelter it can from the northeast winds that come hard off the water in October and November. The pier is rough-cut sandstone, the same warm reddish color as most of the buildings in the town, though in the dark before dawn all of it is the same shade of nothing. A few boats sit in the basin, mostly small craft. Cobbles and fishing boats, their hulls low in the still water, rocking just slightly with the last of the tide's movement. The smell of the harbour is not pleasant, not unpleasant. It is simply the smell of work, rope soaked in salt water and tar, fish that has been gutted and gutted again across many seasons until the stone of the pier itself carries the smell, seaweed drying on the lower rocks. The faint smoke of a fire from somewhere in the town, drifting down toward the water because the air is still. Coal smoke, most likely. East Lothian had access to coal by this period, carried by coastal trade from the Fife collieries or from further west. A hearth lit early means someone has been awake a long time already. To the east of the harbour, the ground rises, not steeply but noticeably. The land beyond the town is agricultural, low and well-drained, part of the broad coastal plain that runs along the southern shore of the Forth. In 1590, this plain is already one of the most productive farming landscapes in Scotland. The fields closest to the town have been worked for centuries. The soil is reddish-brown, light enough to turn with a simple plough, and the autumn harvest is in. The stubble of the barley and oat fields is pale in the dark, almost luminous, as the sky begins to show the first grey at its eastern edge. The ridge lines of the rigs, the long curved strips of ploughed ground, catch what little light there is and give the fields a faint texture, like cloth that has been folded and smoothed. Behind the town, to the south, the ground rises more deliberately toward the low hills, not the dramatic hills of the highlands. These are smooth and rounded, grass-covered, part of the broader landscape of East Lothian that gives way eventually to the Lammermuir Hills further inland. The Lammermoors are not visible yet in this light, but they are there, a dark horizon 10 or 12 miles to the south. Closer in, the land between the town and those hills is open and mostly clear of woodland. By 1590, the great forests that once covered much of lowland Scotland have long been reduced. The fields run out from the town in the old Rigand furrow pattern, divided by low earthen banks and occasional strips of rough ground. The town itself runs roughly east to west along the high street, which follows the line of the ridge. It is not a large town. North Berwick in 1590 is a royal borough, granted that status in the 12th century by David I, but it has never grown into a significant trading centre. Its importance is modest and local. The high street is unpaved, packed earth with stone sets near the market cross. The buildings on either side are mostly single-story or two-story, built of the local red sandstone with rubble cores and lime-washed where the owners have kept them well. The rooflines are irregular. Thatch on some of the older properties near the west end of the street. Pantiles beginning to appear on the newer buildings near the harbour, brought over from the Low Countries as ballast in trading vessels and finding their way into use. In the dark before dawn, they are all shapes against a slightly lighter sky. The market cross stands near the middle of the high street. By 1590, it has been here for generations, the fixed point around which the weekly market organizes itself. On a Tuesday, the market would draw people from the surrounding farms and estates, from Duralton and Fenton and the coastal settlements to the east. But this is not market day. The cross stands alone in the empty street. A dog moves somewhere near it, nose down, crossing from one side of the street to the other without hurrying. The Kirk of St. Andrew stands slightly back from the high street to the south. It is an old building, parts of it dating to the 12th century, and it has been modified and repaired many times. By 1590, Scotland has been officially Protestant for 30 years, since the Reformation of 1560. The old rituals are gone from inside this building. The Latin Mass, the candles, the priests, but the stone is the same stone. The walls are the same walls. The graveyard around the kirk holds generations of the town's families, the stones newer near the paths, older and more worn near the north wall where the ground is damper. A yew tree grows in the southeast corner of the yard. It was old before the Reformation. Closer to the harbour, on the western side, the ruins of the old kirk of St. Andrew on the headland are a different matter. This is an older site, a roofless shell by 1590, the nave open to the sky, the walls still standing to their full height in places, but the interior long since given over to weather and grass. This is the building that sits at the very edge of the headland, with the sea on three sides and the town behind it. In the dark before dawn, its outline against the slightly lighter water is angular and still. The graveyard attached to it is still in use. It has been used for burial since the earliest days of the borough, and possibly before. Out in the Firth, beyond the harbour mouth, the Bass Rock sits 5 miles to the east. In 1590, it is already a well-known landmark, the great basalt plug rising sheer from the water, white with gannets in the summer months, but darkened now in the autumn. At this hour, it is not visible. It is there in the knowledge of everyone who lives on this shore, a fixed point, the edge of the local world. The fishermen know every current around it. The monks who once lived on it, maintaining the chapel of St. Baldred, have been gone since the Reformation. The rock is uninhabited in 1590, though this will not be the case for long. Closer in, the island of Fidra lies to the west-northwest, small and low, barely breaking the water's surface from this angle. It too had a religious establishment, a Cistercian priory founded in the 12th century. By 1590, that is long dissolved. The island sits in the water and does nothing in particular. Seabirds roost on it. The fishermen avoid the rocks around it. The light is changing now, not dramatically. The sky at the eastern horizon is the color of grey linen, slightly different from the grey above it and the grey of the water below it. The horizon is becoming a line. The Bass Rock will be visible soon, a dark mass picked out against the paler sky. The fields to the east of the town are gaining definition, the rig lines clearer, the low banks between the strips of cultivation casting the faintest of shadows. A cock crows somewhere in the town, then another further away, and then a third from the direction of the farms to the south. It is the standard early morning sequence, one bird setting off a chain of them across the whole landscape. The sound carries easily in the still air. There is no wind at all. The smoke from that early fire is rising straight up now, visible against the sky once you know where to look, above the rooflines of the high street. The fishermen who will put out today are already thinking about the tide. The harbour dries at low water. The boats will need to leave on the flood, using the rising tide to clear the harbour mouth and make their way out into the Firth. The target is haddock, mostly. The waters off this part of the Firth of Forth are productive. Haddock, cod, whiting, some herring in the right season, though the major herring fishery is further north and to the east, around the coasts of Fife and Angus. The North Berwick boats are small-scale operators by comparison. A coble is perhaps 20 feet long, open, worked by 2 or 3 men with lines. The lines are baited with mussels, gathered from the rocks on the foreshore at low tide. The mussels will have been collected the previous evening, stored in buckets of sea water overnight. The women of the fishing households are part of this work. Baiting the lines is women's work in this community, as it is along the whole of the East Lothian coast and up into Fife. It is slow work, pulling the hook through the mussel flesh, attaching it securely, keeping the line coiled so it will run free when cast. A single long line for a coble might carry several hundred hooks. The work is done by feel as much as sight, the fingers knowing the motion without needing light. Some of it will be done in the last minutes before the boats go out, finished at the harbour wall while the men load the gear. The gear itself is simple and durable. Hemp rope for the main lines, horsehair leaders on the hooks. The hooks are iron, small, hand-forged by the local smith or bought from a merchant in Haddington or Edinburgh. The baskets for carrying the lines are woven willow. The boats carry a stone or two of salt for preserving the catch if they are out long enough to need it, though most trips from North Berwick are half-day affairs, out and back on the same tide. The smell of salt fish is embedded in the walls of the houses nearest the harbour. In the houses themselves, the floors are beaten earth or stone flags. The central fire in older houses burns on a flat hearth in the middle of the main room, the smoke finding its way out through a hole in the thatch or through a simple clay chimney hood. In the newer buildings, or in the houses of the more prosperous burgesses, there is a proper stone fireplace built into the wall. The fuel this morning is coal or peat, most likely a mix of both. Peat can be cut from the mosses inland, carried into town on horseback or by cart. Coal costs more but burns hotter and longer. The diet in a North Berwick household in 1590 is built around oatmeal. Porridge in the morning, brose if there is not time to cook properly, oatcakes baked on a flat iron girdle set over the fire. The oats come from the fields outside the town, ground at the borough mill. There would have been a mill on the Isle Burn, the small burn that runs into the bay to the west of the town. Kale grows in the gardens behind most houses, a hardy brassica that survives the East Coast winters and provides the green matter that goes into the daily pottage. Dried fish, salted butter, hard cheese from the cattle kept on the common grazing. Bread made from barley when the oat supply runs low. Very little wheat. Wheat is a luxury on this coast. The clothes worn by the men going to the harbour this morning are wool entirely, wool woven locally or bought at market. The plaid, a length of woven wool cloth, serves as both outer garment and blanket, wrapped and belted at the waist, thrown over the shoulder. Linen underneath, a shirt or smock worn against the skin. Leather shoes or none at all, depending on the season and the means of the wearer. The fishermen working the harbour in the dark and wet will have their feet wrapped in rags or rough leather. Their hands are thick with callus and salt damage. The cold in October on the North Berwick shore is not extreme, but it is persistent. The wind, when it comes off, the water carries it straight through cloths. The sky is lighter now. The Bass Rock has appeared, just barely, a dark shape 5 miles out. The water between the harbour mouth and the rock is ruffled slightly at its surface, catching the first grey of the dawn. A gannet crosses the field of view from west to east, low over the water, unhurried, already working. The birds are always ahead of the light. The first of the fishing households has a lamp showing in its window, the glow warm against the grey of the stonework outside. Someone is pulling on their outer clothes in that light, or stirring the fire, or starting the process that will lead, within the hour, to a boat being pushed away from the harbour wall, and the lines being run out into the cold water of the Firths. The harbour is still dark. A faint grey sits above the Bass Rock 3 miles out in the Firth of Forth. It is November. The water is flat and cold. A few herring boats are pulled up on the shingle, their tarred hulls glistening with overnight damp. The first man awake in the borough is likely a fisherman. He lives in a low stone cottage on the eastern side of the town, close to the shore. The walls are rubble-built, lime-mortared, and thick enough to keep out the wind off the Forth. The roof is thatched with bent grass from the links. The floor inside is packed earth. There is one room, sometimes two, and a hearth in the center, where the peat has been banked overnight to keep a low heat. He wakes before 5. There is no clock. He knows the time by the quality of the dark and by long habit. He pulls on his breeches, which are coarse woolen cloth, a dull brown or grey in colour. Over a linen shirt, he layers a woolen doublet, well worn at the elbows. His stockings are hand-knitted, thick, and already slightly damp from yesterday's work. His boots are simple leather, creased at the toe, resoled at least once. He does not lace them immediately. He tends the fire first. His wife is already up. She rakes the peat, adds fresh turves, and sets a small iron pot over the flames. The pot holds the remnants of yesterday's pottage. In 1590 in East Lothian, the morning meal for a working household is simple and filling. Oats are the staple. The pottage is made from oatmeal, water, and whatever the household has to hand. A few dried herbs, perhaps a small piece of salted fish, the heel of a kale plant from the garden strip behind the house. It is eaten from a wooden bowl with a horn spoon. There is no bread at this hour unless it was baked the previous day. Bread in a fisherman's house is oat bannock, cooked on a flat iron girdle over the fire. It is dense and slightly smoky, and it lasts 2 or 3 days before it hardens past eating. If there is a bannock from yesterday, he takes a piece of it with him. He wraps it in a cloth and tucks it into a leather satchel or simply into the front of his doublet. He walks to the harbour. The distance from most dwellings in North Berwick to the shoreline is short. The borough in 1590 is a small settlement, compact around its main street and its shore. The street running west from the harbour is the principal thoroughfare. It is unpaved. In wet weather it is mud. In November it is almost always wet. The houses along it are low and set close together. Most face the street directly. A few have a small yard or a midden heap to one side. The walk to the boats takes perhaps 4 minutes for a man living on the east side of town, perhaps 8 or 9 for one living further along the main street toward the west. There is no lighting. He walks by memory and by the faint reflected light off the water. At the harbour, the boats are open-decked, clinker-built vessels between 20 and 30 feet in length. They are rigged for sail when conditions allow, rowed when they do not. The oars are heavy, unvarnished wood, worn smooth at the grip. The nets are hemp, hand-knotted, heavy when wet. They smell of brine and fish oil and old rope. A man's hands after a season of network are hardened and cracked. He may rub them with tallow before putting them into cold water, but he may not. The fish they are after in November are principally herring and cod. The herring season is largely done by this point in the year, but cod can still be taken in the fourth through winter. They also take haddock. North Berwick's fishermen in this period supply the local market and also contribute to the salt-curing trade that feeds the wider region through the winter months. Salt is brought in by boat from other parts of the coast and is stored in the toll booth or in merchant warehouses near the harbour. A second man rising at this same hour is a salt worker. The salt pans on the East Lothian coast are not located in North Berwick itself, but they are close enough to be part of the same working world. The principal salt-working activity in this area in 1590 is at Aberlady and along the coast toward Preston Pans, some miles to the west. But salt trade and salt handling are present in North Berwick as a point of distribution and storage. A man involved in this trade may have walked as far as 2 miles along the coastal path before the sun has properly risen. A third worker is a maltman. Barley is the primary crop of East Lothian, and the conversion of barley into malt is one of the key industries of the region in the 16th century. The maltman spreads his wetted barley on a stone or clay floor to germinate, then dries it over a fire. His work begins early because the temperature of the germinating floor must be checked and managed. He is in his barn or malting house before light. The malting house in a borough like North Berwick in 1590 is a single-story stone building with a kiln at one end. The smell of it, sweet and heavy and slightly earthy, is one of the persistent smells of the borough. He wears a coarse linen apron over his working clothes. His breeches are the same rough wool as the fisherman's. His doublet is older, stained at the front with malt dust and moisture. He wears a flat bonnet on his head, woolen, in a blue-grey colour. The blue bonnet is near universal among working men in lowland Scotland at this period. It is knitted in the round, fulled in hot water to felt it slightly, and then stretched over a wooden block to dry into its flat shape. It is warm and it sheds rain reasonably well, and it costs very little to produce. The maltman's breakfast is also pottage. His wife makes it thinner than yesterday's, stretching the oatmeal further because the barley stores are not yet ground, and the household grain reserve is low in November before the autumn malting is sold. He eats standing. He does not sit down for a morning meal. He takes a drink of ale before he leaves. The ale is small ale, brewed at home, low in strength, and stored in a wooden barrel just inside the door. It is drunk from a leather or wooden cup. It is safer to drink than water drawn from the borough's wells, which in 1590 are frequently contaminated by the same midden heaps that line the back lanes. A fourth worker rising at this hour is the cordwainer. He makes shoes. In a borough of North Berwick's size in 1590, there is likely 1 or perhaps 2 shoemakers working. The cordwainer's craft is organized through a guild structure, loosely applied in a small borough like this, but present nonetheless. He works with cow leather, dressed and softened by a tanner whose work is done outside the borough limits because of the smell and the pollution it creates in water sources. The tanner's yard, if there is one in this period, would be on the far edge of the settlement near a small burn. The cordwainer wakes in a house that is also his workshop. His bench is against the wall nearest the window, such as the window is. It is an opening with a wooden shutter rather than glass. In November, he works with the shutter open enough to let in light and closed enough to keep out the worst of the cold. He works by natural light and by a tallow candle set in an iron holder when the light fails. His tools are laid out on the bench before he sits down, a last of wood in the approximate shape of a human foot, a curved all-for-piercing leather, a heavy curved needle. Linen thread waxed with beeswax to prevent rotting, a smooth-faced hammer for flattening seams. Before he begins, he eats. His household's morning meal is a bowl of brose, which is oatmeal with hot water poured over it, sometimes with a little salt. It is simpler than pottage and quicker to prepare. He adds a spoonful of butter if there is any. Butter in East Lothian in this period is often salted for preservation and stored in small wooden firkins. A firkin might last a household of 4 several weeks if used sparingly. The cordwainer's wife makes the brose, tends the youngest child, and then walks with a basket to a neighboring yard where she has an arrangement with a woman who keeps 2 or 3 hens. She collects eggs, which may or may not be available on any given morning in November. A fifth worker, and in some ways the most visible in the borough, is the smith. The blacksmith in North Berwick in 1590 works from a forge that is likely on the main street or on a side lane wide enough to allow horses to be brought in for shoeing. His forge is lit before first light. The bellows are worked by a young apprentice, a boy of 12 or 13 who sleeps in a corner of the smithy on a straw pallet. The apprentice's job in the early morning is to relight the fire from the banked coals of the previous evening and to have the forge at working heat before the smith arrives. The smith himself walks from his house, perhaps 3 or 4 minutes away. He is a large man by the standards of the time, meaning that he is well fed enough by his trade to have maintained physical bulk. He wears a heavy leather apron that reaches to mid-thigh. His shirt is linen but heavier than the fisherman's, and he wears no doublet at the forge because of the heat. He binds his forearms with strips of leather to protect them from sparks. His bonnet is the same flat blue woolen type as the other men of the borough. He eats at home before he goes. His wife keeps a slightly better table than the fisherman's wife because smithing is a skilled trade and the smith charges accordingly for his work. His morning meal is pottage with a piece of boiled kale, and there is a bannock baked that morning, not left over. There may be a small piece of hard cheese, made from the milk of a cow kept on the common grazings outside the borough. North Berwick in 1590 has access to common land to the west and south of the settlement, where townspeople have the right to graze animals under a regulated system. The smith's work that day will include horseshoes, nails, hinge fittings for a new door being hung at one of the merchants' houses on the main street, and possibly the repair of a broken anchor bracket brought up from the harbour. He will also receive a commission later in the morning from the keeper of the mill for a new iron pin for the mill mechanism. The mill is a grain mill, water-powered, sitting on the small burn that runs south of the town. It is one of the borough's essential pieces of infrastructure, and its maintenance is a continuous concern. A sixth worker is the Webster. The Webster is a weaver. In East Lothian in 1590, there is a consistent demand for plain woolen cloth and for coarse linen made from locally grown flax. The Webster works at a floor loom, a heavy timber frame set up in a room of his house or in a separate outbuilding. The loom takes up most of the available space. The sound of it, a rhythmic thump and shuttle, begins before the borough is fully awake and continues until the light goes in the afternoon. His breakfast is the same oatmeal pottage that feeds most of the town. He eats quickly. He is already calculating the morning's work in his mind as he sits with the bowl. He has a commission for 6 ells of plain grey woolen cloth from a merchant in the borough who is preparing an order for market day. 6 ells is roughly 7 yards. At his rate of work, it will take him the better part of a full day to complete it. He will sit at the loom from first light until the candle is too unreliable to work by without risking mistakes in the weave. Outside, the borough is beginning to move. The main street is acquiring the first sounds of the working day. A cart horse is being led from a stable yard. The smell of peat smoke is rising from every chimney hole in the roofline. A dog crosses the street. The grey above the Bass Rock has lightened to a pale silver. The tide is coming in, and the first of the fishing boats is being pushed off the shingle into the cold water of the harbour mouth. The men on it say nothing to each other that needs to be recorded. They know what they are doing. They have done it before. The boats left the harbour before the light came up. The men had been awake since 4, moving quietly through the narrow closes that ran down toward the shore. North Berwick's harbour in 1590 was a small stone structure, little more than a curved arm of rubble masonry reaching into the Firth of Forth. The walls were low and salt-whitened. The smell of kelp and fish oil hung in the air at all hours. The main work of the town was fishing. It had been fishing for as long as anyone could record, and the Firth of Forth gave reliably in those years. The primary catch was herring, followed by haddock and cod. White fish were taken close to shore in the summer months, and the herring came in runs that the men had learned to read across generations. The boats used in 1590 were mostly small open vessels called cobles. A coble was flat-bottomed and broad in the beam, built to be launched directly from a beach. North Berwick had both the harbour and a stretch of open sand to the west of it, and boats were kept in both places depending on the season and the weather. A coble of this period might be 20 feet in length, rowed by 2 or 3 men, with a simple square sail raised when the wind allowed. They were built from oak planking, and the local men who maintained them caulked the seams with oakum and pine tar each spring. The ropes used aboard these vessels were made from hemp. They were thick and stiff in cold weather, softer and more pliable after a wet morning at sea. Each man coiled his own lines when he returned to shore. The nets were drift nets for herring, long curtains of mesh that hung vertically in the water, held at the surface by wooden or cork floats and weighted at the foot with small stones or lead sinkers. The mesh size was fixed by custom and by the need to let smaller fish pass through. A full drift net might run to several 100 feet in total length when all the sections were joined together. Setting the nets was done in late afternoon or at dusk. The boat would move slowly with the tide while the net paid out over the stern, one man feeding it over the side while another kept the vessel steady on the oars. The floats bobbed in the dark water behind them. The men then waited or slept a little in the bottom of the boat, wrapped in heavy woolen cloaks. They hauled the nets in the early hours, hand over hand, the wet rope dragging at their palms. The herring came up silver in whatever light was available, twisting and stiff in the mesh. Back at the harbour, the catch was unloaded into wooden baskets called creels. These were carried up the stone steps of the harbour wall by the fishermen or by the women who came down to meet the boats. The steps were worn smooth in the middle from decades of this same traffic. The fish were tipped onto wooden tables set up near the harbour for gutting and sorting. The gutting knives were short and broad, kept sharp on a leather strop. A skilled woman could gut and clean a herring in a few seconds, the motion becoming entirely automatic after years of the same work. The women of North Berwick played a central role in the fish trade. They were the fishwives, and their work began the moment the boats came in. They gutted, salted, and packed the fish. They also carried fish inland to sell, walking as far as Haddington, which lay roughly 10 miles to the southwest along the road through the fields. They carried the fish in large wicker creels on their backs, supported by a leather strap across the forehead. A full creel of herring or haddock might weigh close to 200 pounds. The women wore heavy woolen skirts and linen aprons, and their feet were often bare on the road in the summer months. The salting of fish was done in wooden barrels near the harbour. The barrels were made by the town's coopers, who worked in a yard a short distance from the water. In 1590, there were coopers established in the borough, as the preservation of fish for trade required a steady supply of tight barrels. The fish were packed in layers with coarse salt between each layer. The salt came from the salt pans that operated along the Forth coastline, including those at Preston Pans, which lay about 8 miles to the west. The barrels, once filled and sealed, could be sold on or transporting to markets in Edinburgh or further afield. The herring trade connected North Berwick to a wider economy. Ships from the Low Countries called at ports along the Forth, and salted Scottish herring was a commodity that moved through those networks. The harbour at North Berwick was not large enough for ocean-going vessels of any significant size, but smaller trading craft could use it in reasonable weather. The deeper anchorage was off the shore rather than inside the harbour walls. Goods moving between North Berwick and Edinburgh often went by sea rather than by road, the road being slower and less reliable. The physical town in 1590 was compact. The high street ran roughly east to west, parallel to the shore and a short distance above it. The closes and vennels leading from the high street down toward the water were unnamed in any formal sense, but they had their own characters and their own uses. Some led to the harbour steps. Others opened onto the fish market area. The buildings along the high street were mostly single-story or two-story structures of local stone with thatched roofs, though some of the more substantial merchant houses had pantile roofs. The pantiles came from the Netherlands as ballast in trading ships, and their use in East Lothian was well established by the late 16th century. The ground floor of a typical merchant's house on the high street might serve as a storage area for trade goods. The family would live on the upper floor. In a fisherman's cottage further from the center, the family and sometimes the animals occupied the same building, divided by a low partition. The floors were earthen. The hearth was in the center of the main room or against a gable wall, the smoke rising to a hole in the roof or a simple chimney of wattle and daub. Heat was from peat or wood. Coal was available in this period along the Forth, mined at Preston Pans and other sites, and it was beginning to appear in the homes of those who could afford it, but peat remained the common fuel. Away from the harbour, the land rose gently to the south. The fields around North Berwick in 1590 were cultivated in the run-rig system. This meant the arable land was divided into long, narrow strips raised slightly at the centre, with drainage channels between them. The ridges were ploughed each year by teams of oxen, 4 or 6 animals yoked together to pull a heavy wooden plough with an iron share. The ploughman walked behind, guiding the plough with both hands. A second man, the gadsman, led the oxen. Ploughing was hard and slow, covering perhaps half an acre in a day. The main crops around North Berwick were bearer, which is a form of barley and oats. Bearer was the older grain and grew well in the coastal soils of East Lothian. It was used for brewing ale and for making bannocks, a flat bread cooked on a griddle over the fire. Oats were ground for porridge and for oatcakes. Kale, a hardy leafy vegetable, grew in every garden plot. It was boiled with whatever else was available and formed a central part of the daily diet at every level of society. The smell of kale cooking was constant in the town throughout the autumn and winter months. The mill for grinding grain stood to the south of the town centre. Mills in this period were typically powered by water, and the mill at North Berwick used a lade, a channel cut to divert water from a burn to drive the wheel. The millstone was a heavy disc of dressed stone, the upper stone turning on the lower, the grain fed in through a hole at the center, and the meal emerging at the edges. The miller took a proportion of each load as his fee, a custom known as the multure. Every tenant on the surrounding estates was obliged to bring their grain to the designated mill, a system called thirlage that tied the rural population to specific mills. The sound of the mill working was a steady, grinding rumble that could be heard from some distance on a quiet morning. The stone dust rose in the air of the mill building, coating every surface. The miller and his family lived beside the mill. They were important figures in the local economy, handling more grain than almost anyone else in the district, and they were regarded with a mixture of dependence and suspicion. Accusations of short weight or dishonest multure were common in borough records throughout Scotland in this period. Back at the harbour, the working day continued through the morning. The boats that had returned from the overnight drift were being hauled up on the beach or secured at the wall. The nets were spread out on the grass above the shore to be inspected for damage. Torn sections were repaired on the spot, the men sitting cross-legged on the ground with a wooden netting needle and a length of the same twine used to make the net in the first place. The netting needle was a simple flat tool shaped to allow the twine to be threaded and knotted quickly. Repair was a constant task. Nets wore out fast in use, and the cost of replacing one entirely was significant. The ropes, too, needed attention. The hemp lines used for the nets and for the boat's rigging were checked for fraying and weakness. Where a section was too far gone, it was cut out and a splice put in. Splicing rope was a skill every fisherman had from boyhood. The joins in a good splice were almost as strong as the original rope. A poor splice could give way at the worst moment, and the men knew which of their number did clean work and which did not. The harbour area by mid-morning was loud with activity. There were the sounds of wooden boat hulls against the stone wall, the creak of timber, the slap of small waves in the harbour basin. There were the voices of the men calling across the water, the sharper sounds of the gutting work continuing on the tables above, the occasional knock of a mallet where a cooper was working on a barrel. Gulls were overhead and underfoot, pulling at scraps and fighting among themselves. Dogs moved between the working figures. Cats sat on the harbour wall. The borough of North Berwick had its own market cross, standing in the high street. This was the formal point of trade in the town, where goods were bought and sold under the authority of the borough. Market days brought people in from the surrounding parishes, from Duralton to the west and Whitekirk to the east. They came on foot and on horseback, carrying goods or driving small numbers of animals. The roads connecting these communities were unpaved tracks, firm enough in dry weather, badly cut up by cart wheels in the wet months of autumn and winter. A cart laden with meal or salt or dried fish moved slowly on such roads. The merchants of the borough dealt in a range of goods beyond fish. Imported cloth came through the fourth trade. Linen was woven locally, the flax grown in the fields of East Lothian and processed through a sequence of stages that began with retting the stalks in water to soften the fibers, then breaking and scutching to separate the useful fiber from the woody stem, then heckling to comb the fibers straight, and finally spinning. The spinning was done by women in the home, using a hand spindle or a simple wheel. The resulting linen thread was woven on a hand loom into cloth that served for shirts, sheets, and sacking. The weavers of the town worked in their own homes or in small workshops attached to their houses. The sound of a loom in operation, the rhythmic thump of the beater pressing each new row of weft thread into place, was part of the texture of daily life in the borough. A weaver working steadily might produce several yards of cloth in a day, depending on the complexity of the weave. Plain linen for domestic use was the most common product. The cloth came off the loom stiff and slightly grey, and was laid out on the grass to be bleached by sunlight and repeated wetting over several weeks. The tanners of the town worked at the southern edge of the settlement, as far from the centre as possible. Tanning required large quantities of water and produced powerful smells at every stage of the process. Hides came from the cattle slaughtered in the autumn, when feeding over winter was not possible for all the animals. The hides were first soaked in lime pits to loosen the hair, which was then scraped off with a blunt-edged tool called a beam knife. The hides were then moved through a series of pits containing increasingly concentrated solutions of tannin derived from oak bark. The whole process from raw hide to finished leather took months. The oak bark itself was stripped from felled trees and dried, then ground or broken before being packed into the tanning pits with the hides. The leather produced was used for shoes, for harness, for the straps of the creels the fishwives carried, for the bellows in the blacksmith's forge, and for dozens of other purposes throughout the community. The cobbler worked near the market cross, cutting and stitching the finished leather into shoes and boots. The shoes of working people were simple in construction, a single layer of thick sole stitched to an upper that covered the foot to the ankle. They wore quickly on the stone streets and the rough roads, and the cobbler had steady work throughout the year. The tide has gone out across the Forth. The sky above Fife is a pale, washed grey. In North Berwick in 1590, the last of the daylight is settling over the low rooftops of the borough, and the town is drawing itself inward for the night. North Berwick was a small place. The population sat somewhere around 500 souls. The town clustered along a single main street that ran roughly east to west, with narrower closes and wynds cutting down toward the harbour. The harbour itself was modest, built for the herring trade and for the small boats that worked the Firth of Forth. The church of St. Andrew stood at the western end of the promontory, its walls, already old by 1590, exposed to the salt wind off the sea. The houses along the main street were built low. They were timber-framed in places, but many were constructed of locally quarried stone, rough-dressed and laid without great precision. The roofs were thatched with straw or bent grass cut from the coastal margins. Some of the better-off burgesses had begun to use clay pantiles, but these were not yet common in a borough of this size. The walls were thick, partly from necessity and partly because the builders knew the winter winds that came in off the Forth. Inside, the typical house of a North Berwick family in 1590 was a single main room. This room was called the hall, though it was nothing like the great halls of the nobility. It was perhaps 5 or 6 meters long and 4 meters wide. The floor was packed earth, sometimes strewn with rushes, or dried bracken. There was no ceiling above the rafters. The underside of the thatch was visible, darkened by years of smoke. The fire was in the center of that room, or sometimes against one wall if the house was newer, or if someone had taken the trouble to build a proper stone hearth. There was no chimney in the oldest houses. The smoke drifted upward and found its way out through a hole in the roof ridge or through gaps in the thatch itself. Everything in the room carried the smell of wood smoke and peat. The walls were black with it. The rafters above were a deep, oily brown. There was one table. It was a simple plank table, heavy and unpolished, set near the fire. Around it stood wooden stools, low and three-legged, so they could sit steady on the uneven floor. There were no chairs with backs in a household of this kind. A chest stood against one wall, used for storing linen, tools, or whatever the family owned that needed keeping dry and safe. The chest was the most valuable single piece of furniture in the house. Sleeping was done in the same room or in a small chamber partitioned off at one end if the family had the means for it. The beds were wooden frames strung with rope and laid with a straw mattress, sometimes covered with a coarse woolen blanket woven locally. A better family might have a feather mattress, but this was not common. Children slept in the same room as their parents, often in the same bed if the family was large. Warmth was practical, not sentimental. The winter nights in North Berwick were long and cold, and the fire was banked down before sleep, not extinguished. The household would rise before first light. In October, that meant rising in full darkness. The fire was rebuilt from the embers. Peat was the common fuel along this part of the East Lothian coast, cut from the mosses further inland and brought into the borough by cart. Wood was used too, but it was less plentiful. The smell of burning peat would drift from every house along the main street as the morning began. The first meal of the day was simple. Oatmeal was the staple. It was made into porridge, cooked in an iron pot hung over the fire on a chain from a hook in the rafters or on a simple iron bracket. The oatmeal was stirred with a wooden spurtle and eaten from a wooden bowl, standing or sitting at the table. Salt was added if there was enough of it. The borough was near the sea, so salt was more available here than in inland towns, but it still had a price. Milk was added when it was available, which was more often in summer than in winter. Bread was baked in the household or taken to a communal oven. It was made from oats or barley rather than wheat. Wheat was a grain of the south and of the rich. In East Lothian, barley and oats were the everyday crops. The bread was flat and dense, baked on a griddle iron set over the fire. It was not light. It was the kind of bread that filled a stomach quickly and stayed there. The main meal of the day was eaten in the middle of the afternoon. Kale was a constant presence in it. Kale grew in every garden behind the houses, hardy enough to survive the coastal frosts. It was boiled in a pot with whatever else the family had, which might be a piece of salted fish, some dried peas, a bone saved from a previous meal, or occasionally a portion of mutton. The mutton came from the sheep, that grazed on the ground above the town toward the law, the conical volcanic hill that rose behind North Berwick to the south. Fish was not a luxury here. The harbour was active. Herring was the main catch, hauled in during the autumn season by the small boats working the Forth. Herring were smoked or salted for keeping through the winter. They were eaten most days in some form, either as a fresh meal during the season or as a preserved fish, eaten cold or warmed briefly over the fire in the months that followed. Dried cod, brought in by traders, was also available. The smell of curing fish would hang over the harbour quarter of the town from September onward. Ale was drunk by adults and children alike. The water from local wells was not always reliable, and ale was safer. It was brewed in the household itself, or bought from one of the women in the borough who brewed commercially. The ale made in a North Berwick household in 1590 was weak and cloudy. It was not brewed for pleasure alone. It was a food in itself, a source of calories on a day when the food on the table was thin. Women ran the domestic economy of the household almost entirely. The wife of a burgess or a fisherman managed the brewing, the cooking, the drying of fish, the keeping of the kale yard, the care of any animals the family kept. A goat or a few hens was common even within the borough boundaries. The hens were kept for their eggs during the laying months and the goat for its milk. Pigs were kept by some families, fed on kitchen scraps and slaughtered in November when the cold was sufficient to preserve the meat. Pork and salt pork were eaten through the winter months. Clothing in a household of ordinary means was wool throughout. The wool came from local sheep. It was spun in the household, on a drop spindle or on a simple spinning wheel by the women of the family. Older children helped with carding the raw wool before spinning. The yarn was woven into cloth on a loom, which might be kept in the house itself if space allowed, or the weaving might be taken to a fuller or a weaver in the borough. The cloth was rough by later standards, undyed or dyed with locally gathered plants, and heavy. It wore slowly and was repaired as long as it held together. A man of the borough wore a linen shirt next to his skin, a doublet of wool over it, and woolen hose on his legs. He wore a flat bonnet on his head, the blue bonnet that was already by 1590 a common sight across the lowlands. His shoes were simple leather, soled and stitched by a local cordwainer. A woman wore a linen smock as her undergarment, a wool kirtle over that, and a linen cap on her head when indoors. Outdoors, she would add a wool plaid pinned at the shoulder. These were working clothes. They were worn until they could not be repaired. Children were dressed as small adults from about the age of 5 or 6. Before that, young children of both sexes wore long gowns that made no distinction between boys and girls. The gowns were practical. A child in a long gown could be watched and managed more easily. Once a child was old enough to work, which was early by any later reckoning, they wore the same form of clothing as their parents in smaller sizes. Work began early for children. A girl of 8 might already be helping her mother with the brewing or tending the kale yard. A boy of similar age might be helping his father at the harbour, carrying fish baskets, coiling rope, or running messages between the boats and the merchants. Schooling existed in North Berwick in some form by 1590, connected to the borough and to the church. But attendance was not universal, and the children of fishing families or of the poorer craftsmen were more likely to be working than sitting with a schoolmaster. The harbour district of the town was its own world. The boats that worked from North Berwick were small, open craft, crewed by 2 or 3 men. They worked the herring grounds on the Forth and brought their catch back to the harbour, where the women and older children would gut and process the fish on the foreshore. The smell of that work was total. It settled into the hair and clothing of everyone who lived near the harbour. It was simply the smell of the place, unremarkable to those who lived there. Salt for the herring cure came from the salt pans that operated along the Forth coast. The nearest significant salt workings were at Preston Pans, about 12 miles to the west along the coast road. Salt was carried to North Berwick by pack horse or by small coastal vessel. It was expensive enough to be measured carefully. Too little salt and the fish would spoil. Too much and the fish would be inedibly harsh. The women who salted the herring knew the balance by practice rather than by measurement. The rhythm of the year in a North Berwick household was shaped by the sea and by the land equally. Spring brought the planting of kale and other vegetables in the rig behind the house. The barley and oats on the common fields beyond the borough boundary were sown in April. The herring season ran from late summer into the autumn. November was the month of slaughter, when pigs and any cattle not kept through the winter were killed and the meat preserved. December and January were the quiet months, when the boats did not go out and the fields were empty, and the family lived on what had been stored. Winter in a house of this kind was a matter of management. The fire burned as long as fuel lasted. The family sat close to it in the evening. The light was candlelight, from tallow candles made in the household from animal fat rendered down in autumn. Rush lights were also used, made by dipping dried rushes in fat. They gave a dim, unsteady light. Reading by them was difficult, and most people in North Berwick in 1590 could not read in any case. The evenings were short in practice. When it was dark and cold, and the candle was burning low, people went to bed. The house had 1 or perhaps 2 small windows. They were unglazed in most ordinary homes. Glass was a luxury confined to the better merchants and to the church. The windows were covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters that could be closed against the wind. In summer, the shutters stood open and some light came in. In winter, they were closed, and the room was lit only by the fire and the tallow candle. The darkness was a constant feature of domestic life from October to March. Sickness was managed at home. There was no physician in a borough the size of North Berwick. A surgeon might be found in Haddington, the county town 11 miles to the southeast. Within the town, illness was treated with what knowledge the family had, and with remedies passed down through women's knowledge of herbs and plants. Wormwood, yarrow, and garlic were all kept in the household for their medicinal uses alongside their culinary ones. A child with a fever was wrapped in blankets near the fire. A man with a broken bone might be taken to someone in the borough with the skill to set it. Infant mortality was high and was understood to be high. A family with 5 living children had almost certainly buried 1 or 2 others. The churchyard of St. Andrew stood at the western edge of the promontory, exposed to the wind off the Forth. Small graves were not unusual there. Baptism took place within days of birth, not weeks, because the chance that a child would not survive was always present. The borough minister would have known many families who had lost children before their second year. The domestic life of North Berwick in 1590 was not a life of comfort in any modern sense, but it was ordered, and it was purposeful, and it was conducted with a practical knowledge of the landscape and the sea that had been built up over many generations. The kale in the yard behind the house, the salt herring in the barrel by the wall, the peat smoke rising from the roof hole into the grey evening sky above the Forth. These were the coordinates of an ordinary life in this small coastal borough, in the last decade of the 16th century, when the tide had gone out and the night was coming in from the east. The harbour mouth at North Berwick faces north into the Firth of Forth. In 1590, the water was close to everything. The town sat at the edge of the sea, and the sea set the pace of the week. The market cross stood near the centre of the borough. It was the fixed point around which trade and law and gossip all turned. On market days, which fell on a Thursday in this period, traders came in from the surrounding parishes. They brought grain from the fields of Duralton and Athelstaneford. They brought salt fish from the coast. They brought wool clip from the farms that ran back toward Haddington. The cross was where prices were called and where disputes were heard. North Berwick held its market charter from the medieval period. By 1590, the borough was small but functioning. It had perhaps 400 or 500 souls within its bounds. The main street ran roughly east to west, back from the harbour, and the houses along it were mostly single-story or low two-story buildings of rubble stone. Thatched roofs were still common. The smoke from morning fires hung low over the town on still autumn days. The kirk of North Berwick stood to the west of the town, near the harbour promontory. It was a substantial building for a borough of this size. By 1590, it had been reformed for a generation. The old Catholic furnishings were gone. The altars had been cleared. The walls were plain. Services were conducted in Scots and English, not in Latin. The minister read scripture, gave a sermon, and led the congregation in prayer. The sermon could last an hour or more. People stood or sat on wooden stools they had brought from home. Sunday was the day that shaped everything else. The church bell rang in the morning and the town stopped. Shops were shut. Fires were banked down. Work of any kind was strongly discouraged. The kirk session, which was the body of elected elders that governed church discipline, could summon anyone found working on the Sabbath. They could fine them. They could require them to stand before the congregation and confess. This was not a distant threat. The records of kirk sessions across East Lothian from this period are full of such cases. People were called before the elders for washing clothes, for carrying peats, for travelling without sufficient reason. The Kirk session met regularly to hear these matters. They sat in the church itself, or sometimes in an adjacent building. The session clerk kept written records. In 1590, the session at North Berwick was active, as sessions across the region were. This was the year in which the North Berwick witch trials began, and the session and the wider legal apparatus were already under considerable strain. But on ordinary Sundays, the session's business was the ordinary business of a small community. Neighbors reported neighbors. Minor disputes over debts or slander were heard. Couples who had conceived before marriage were required to appear publicly and repent. After the morning service, there was a quiet period in the early afternoon. People ate at home. The meal on a Sunday was not elaborate. Oat bread, salt fish, perhaps a little dried meat if the household had it. Fresh meat was not common in autumn and winter. The cattle and sheep that had not been kept for breeding were slaughtered in November because there was rarely enough fodder to carry them through the winter. This was called the Martinmas slaughter, and it fell around the 11th of November. Martinmas was one of the great hinge points of the year. It was a Scottish quarter day, one of the 4 dates on which rents were due, servants changed employment, and debts were settled. In 1590, Martinmas fell on the 11th of November by the old calendar. Across East Lothian, farm servants who had completed their 6-month or year-long contracts were paid off and sought new positions. Feeing markets were held in towns like Haddington, where workers and farmers came together to agree new terms. North Berwick itself was a smaller centre, but people from the surrounding farms would have moved through the town at this time of year. The other quarter days were Candlemas in February, Whitsunday in May, and Lammas in August. Each brought its own rhythm. Whitsunday in May was a time for planting and for movement. Lammas in August was tied to the grain harvest, which in East Lothian could begin as early as late July if the season had been warm. The harvest was a communal effort. People from the town itself joined the farm workers in the fields. The borough and the surrounding land were not sharply separated. Many people in North Berwick kept a strip of ground, a kylliard, or a small number of animals on the common land outside the town. The common land lay to the south and east of the built borough. The law, the volcanic hill that rises steeply behind the town, was a landmark and a grazing ground. Sheep were pastured on its lower slopes. The right to graze on the common was tied to burgess status. Only full burgesses could exercise these rights in theory, though in practice the edges were contested, and the Kirk session and the borough court both heard cases about misuse of the common. The borough court was separate from the Kirk session. It dealt with property, trade, and local order. The bailies, who were the elected magistrates of the borough, presided. They sat in the toll booth, which was the main civic building. In 1590, North Berwick had a toll booth, though it was a modest structure. It served as courthouse, council chamber, and jail. Fines collected there funded the borough's small expenses. The maintenance of the harbour was one such expense, because the harbour was the economic heart of the place. Fishing sustained a significant part of the town. The boats that worked from North Berwick were small. They were open or half-decked vessels suitable for inshore work in the Firth. They went out for white fish, principally haddock and cod, and for herring during the herring season in summer and autumn. The fish were gutted on the beach or on the harbour pier. Salt was applied. Much of the catch was dried or lightly salted and then sold. Some went to Haddington and to Edinburgh, which was only 20 or so miles to the west along the coast road. The road to Edinburgh was a rutted track for much of its length. It followed the coast where possible. Carts and pack horses used it. Travelling merchants known as chapmen came along it periodically. They carried small goods, needles, thread, ribbons, small blades, printed pamphlets if they had them. They stopped in towns like North Berwick for a day or two. They sold from their packs rather than from fixed stalls. Their arrival was a small event in a town where novelty was infrequent. Feast days under the Reformed Kirk were a complicated matter in 1590. Scotland had formally abolished the Catholic Church in 1560, 30 years earlier. The great feasts of the old calendar, Christmas, Easter, Saints' Days, had no official standing in the Reformed Church. The General Assembly of the Kirk had repeatedly discouraged their observance. And yet the rhythms of the old year were not entirely gone. Christmas was still called Yule by many people in Scotland. The 12 days of Yule were still a period when work slackened and people gathered. The Kirk session records show that the elders were still fighting this tendency in the 1590s. People were still fined for playing games on Yule Day, for dancing, for lighting bonfires. Beltane on the 1st of May was another such persistence. It was a pre-Christian festival far older than the church in Scotland. Young people went out at dawn to gather greenery. Fires were lit on hilltops. In 1590, these practices were still occurring in parts of Scotland, though they were increasingly suppressed in the lowland boroughs. East Lothian was not a conservative or Highland area. The Reformation had taken firm hold here, but folk memory was long, and the turning of the seasons still carried weight. The week itself had a clear shape. Monday through Saturday were working days, though Saturday afternoons sometimes lightened before the Sabbath. Market day on Thursday was the social peak of the working week. The harbour was busiest on days when the wind and tide were right for sailing. There was no controlling those days. Fishermen left before dawn and returned in the afternoon if the sea permitted. Their wives and daughters worked on the shore, preparing the catch, salting, drying, carrying to market. Women in North Berwick in 1590 were present in almost every space of daily life. They traded at the market. They appeared before the Kirk session. They borrowed and lent money. They ran households that were also places of small-scale production. Spinning was constant. Flax was grown in East Lothian, and the processing of flax into linen yarn was a domestic occupation spread across every household with women and older children in it. The yarn was sold on or woven at home on simple looms. The resulting cloth was coarse but serviceable. The better cloth came from further away. Imported fabric, fine woolen broadcloth, came through Edinburgh's merchants and trickled outward to the smaller towns. A burgess of North Berwick with a comfortable income might wear a coat of dark broadcloth on Sunday. His wife might have a gown of the same, with a white linen cap and collar. Working clothes were simpler: rough linen shirts, woolen pladding, leather shoes if you had them. Many people in 1590 went without shoes in summer, keeping them for winter and for Sundays. The alehouse was another gathering place, functioning throughout the week, but most active on market days and on the evenings before rest days. The brewing of ale was a domestic trade. Women called alewives brewed in their homes and sold from their own premises. The kirk session disapproved of excessive drinking, and alehouse keepers were regularly brought before the elders for selling during sermon time or for allowing disorderly behavior. The ale itself was low in alcohol by modern standards. It was made from malted barley and water. It was consumed in large quantities because water from open sources was often unsafe. The shore itself was a social space as much as a working one. People gathered there in the evenings in summer when the light lasted late. In June and July, the sky over the firth did not fully darken until well past 9 in the evening. Children played on the beach. Older men sat and talked. The Bass Rock, which stands offshore to the east, was visible from the town and from the harbour. In 1590, it was used as a prison. State prisoners were held there by the Crown. It was a hard place, isolated in the sea, cold and salt-scoured. The people of North Berwick would have seen it every day, a dark mass on the water. The old kirk stood on a small promontory to the west of the harbour. By 1590, it had been largely abandoned as a place of regular worship. The main congregation had moved to the newer kirk building, but the old kirk still stood, roofless by some accounts, or at least partially ruined. It was a place that retained a presence in the community's imagination. Churchyards remained in use. Burials continued near the old walls. People passed it daily walking to the shore. It was part of the fabric of the place in a way that did not require explanation or ceremony. The graveyard was also a place of community record. Burial rites in the Reformed kirk were plain. There was no requiem mass, no prayers for the dead in the Catholic sense. A short service was held. The body was wrapped in a linen winding sheet. The grave was dug by the gravedigger, who was paid a small fee by the family. Wealthier families might have a flat grave slab. Most graves were unmarked or marked with a simple wooden board that would not last the decade. The parish kept a record of baptisms and marriages in the register, though the keeping of burial registers was less consistent in this period. Baptism brought the community together in a different way. A child born to a burgess family would be baptized within days of birth. The whole household gathered, along with neighbours and kin. The minister performed the rite at the font in the kirk. In the Reformed tradition, there was no godparent in the Catholic sense, but witnesses were present and recorded. After the baptism, there was a gathering at the family's home. Food and drink were shared. This was one of the permitted celebrations, a moment when the strict discipline of the Sabbath did not apply because it fell on a weekday and had the blessing of the kirk. The year moved through these moments steadily. Birth, marriage, death, the harvest, the slaughter, the sowing, the market cross on Thursday, the church bell on Sunday morning, the tide coming in across the harbour bar in the grey light before anyone in the town was fully awake. The smell of salt and peat smoke together, which was the ordinary smell of the place from October through to April. The herring boats drawn up on the shingle above the high water mark. The Bass Rock sitting in the water to the east, neither welcoming nor threatening, simply. The tide had pulled back from the harbour wall by the time the last fishing boat was beached for the night. The stone pier at North Berwick was short and low, barely 40 feet in length, and it caught the full force of the easterly winds that came off the Firth of Forth without warning in October. The boats pulled up on the shore were small open craft, each no more than 20 feet from stem to stern. They were built from overlapping planks of oak and elm, and they smelled of salt and rendered fat and old rope. The harbour sat at the foot of a narrow strip of land. To the south, the ground rose quickly toward the Garleton Hills, and beyond them, further inland, the land flattened into the great agricultural plain of East Lothian. To the north, there was nothing but water. The Firth of Forth was wide here, perhaps 14 miles across to the Fife coast at Ely, and on clear evenings the far shore was visible as a dark line above the water. The Bass Rock stood about 2 miles offshore to the east. It was a hard block of basalt rising steeply from the sea, and in 1590 it was the nesting ground of tens of thousands of gannets, as it had been for centuries before. The town itself in 1590 was a small place. Perhaps 300 people lived within it, maybe fewer. The main street ran roughly east to west, and the houses along it were built of rough-dressed sandstone with thatched roofs. Some of the older buildings near the harbour had roofs of turf laid over timber rafters. The street was unpaved and churned to mud in autumn. Dung from cattle and horses lay along its edges and was gathered periodically by those who needed it for their fields. The Kirk of St. Andrew stood near the centre of the settlement. Its tower was the tallest structure visible for some distance. The church had stood there in various forms since the 12th century, and by 1590 its walls carried the repairs and additions of many generations. The roof was in reasonable condition, but the interior was plain, stripped of much of its earlier ornament after the Reformation of 1560. The congregation gathered there each Sunday under the watch of their minister, and the building also served as a point of reference and a gathering place for the broader community of the borough. Around the town, the agricultural land had been farmed in the runrig system for generations. Long, narrow strips of cultivated ground ran outward from the settlement, worked by tenant farmers and their families. In 1590, The principal crops in this part of East Lothian were here barley, oats, and a little rye. Wheat was grown further inland, where the soil was richer and better drained. The ground near the coast was sandy in places, and the soil required careful management. Tenants worked their strips by hand and with wooden ploughs drawn by teams of oxen. Iron was used sparingly, mostly for the ploughshare and a few cutting tools. A generation before, in the 1550s and early 1560s, the pattern of cultivation had been much the same. The runrig strips were older than anyone could remember, but one change visible by 1590 was a modest expansion in the area under cultivation south and west of the town. Some moorland that had lain rough in the 1550s had been brought partially into use. It had not been fully cleared or drained, but the edges of it were grazed more deliberately, and in places shallow furrows had been cut into the margins. This was slow, partial work, done without the tools or capital that would have made it quicker. The moorland itself extended across the higher ground to the south of the town and along the ridge toward Duralton and beyond. In 1590, it was a landscape of heather, coarse grasses, and rushes. Boggy ground lay in the hollows where drainage was poor. Peat was cut from the deeper deposits for fuel. Households in North Berwick burned peat through the autumn and winter months, and the smell of it was constant in the town from September onward. The peat banks were worked by hand with a flat iron spade called a tuskar, and the cut blocks were stacked to dry over the summer before being carried down to the town. Livestock was central to life in the town and on the surrounding farms. Cattle were the most important animals. They provided milk, labor in the fields, and eventually meat and leather. The cattle kept in East Lothian at this period were small and hardy, closer in size and build to the older native breeds than to the improved stock that would come in later centuries. They were walked to summer pastures on the higher ground and returned to the lower fields and town enclosures as the season turned. By October, they were brought in close to the buildings, and those that could not be wintered on stored fodder were slaughtered. The salted carcasses were packed into barrels or hung in cool outbuildings. Sheep were kept on the moorland and on the rougher grazing ground. In 1590, sheep in this part of Scotland were used primarily for wool rather than for meat, though mutton was eaten when animals were culled. The wool clip was sold through the local market at Haddington, which lay about 7 miles inland to the southwest. Haddington was the principal market town of East Lothian, and it drew traders from across the region. Farmers from the land around North Berwick would carry or cart their goods there for sale and return with what they could not produce themselves. Pigs were kept in small numbers by individual households. They were fed on kitchen waste and foraged on the margins of the settlement. Geese and hens were common in the yards behind houses. Their eggs were eaten through the spring and summer, and the birds themselves provided meat in the autumn. A few households kept doves in small stone doocots, mostly for the eggs and for the dung, which was valued as a fertilizer on kitchen gardens. The Firth of Forth provided a large part of the protein in the local diet. Herring was the most important fish, and the late summer herring fishery was a defining feature of the year. Boats from North Berwick and from other small ports along the Lothian coast would follow the herring shoals into the Firth during July, August, and September. The fish were landed and gutted on the beach, then packed in salt and stored in wooden barrels. Dried and salted herring was eaten through the winter months by virtually every household. Fresh fish was a summer food. By November, the herring were largely gone from the inshore waters. Cod and haddock were taken throughout the year from the deeper water further into the Firth. Line fishing from open boats was the method. Long lines with multiple baited hooks were set and retrieved by 2- or 3-man crews. The work was cold and physically demanding, particularly from October onward, when the westerly and northwesterly gales came in. Boats were lost in these waters, and every man who fished knew that risk. There was no lighthouse on the Bass Rock in 1590. A fire had been kept on the rock in earlier centuries as a mark, but by this period, the rock served principally as a gannet colony and an occasional place of confinement. A generation before, in the 1550s, the fishing had been conducted in essentially the same way. The boats had been the same type, the methods unchanged. One difference by 1590 was that the herring fishery in the Firth of Forth had become more organized. There were agreements between different fishing communities about the division of grounds, and there was a modest trade in salted fish, with markets further afield. Some of the catch from North Berwick left the region entirely, carried by larger vessels that called at the harbour, and onward to ports on the east coast of England or across to the Low Countries. The coastline east of the town was shaped by a series of rocky outcrops and short sandy bays. The beach at Milsea Bay lay just east of the harbour, backed by low dunes and rough marram grass. Further east, the ground became rockier and more exposed. Seaweed was gathered from the rocks after storms. It was spread on the fields as a fertilizer, particularly on the sandier ground near the coast where the soil was thin. This practice was well established long before 1590, and it continued with little change from one generation to the next. The dunes behind the beach supported a particular kind of vegetation. Marram grass held the sand in place. Behind it grew a rough covering of bent grass, sea holly, and in places a low scrub of elder and willow. The ground between the dunes and the first cultivated fields was neither farmed nor entirely wild. Rabbits had been introduced to some of the dune systems in East Lothian in earlier centuries and were kept in managed warrens. They provided meat and fur, and the warrens were maintained by the landowners who held them as an economic asset. The water supply for the town came from wells and from small streams that ran off the higher ground to the south. The streams were seasonal in character, running strongly in winter and spring and reducing to a trickle by August in dry years. Wells were dug at intervals within the settlement and on the surrounding land. The water in them was generally clean enough by the standards of the period, though contamination from animal waste was a persistent problem. Illness from waterborne causes was common in the summer months, when the population was largest and the water table lowest. To the south of the moorland and the cultivated fields, the Garleton Hills formed a low but clearly defined ridge. They rose to just over 500 feet at their highest point. In 1590, they were largely bare of trees on the upper slopes, covered instead with heather, gorse, and rough pasture. The lower slopes on the north-facing side held some remnant woodland of oak, hazel, and birch. These woods had been more extensive a generation earlier. By 1590, the pressure of grazing and the demand for timber and fuel had reduced them. Regeneration was slow where livestock had access to the ground, and by the late 16th century, the woodland cover in this part of East Lothian was noticeably thinner than it had been in the 1530s or 1540s. The seasonal rhythm of the year was strongly felt in North Berwick. Spring came slowly to this coast. The easterly winds off the North Sea kept the temperature low well into April, and the farmers working the run-rig strips in March were often doing so in bitter cold. Seed oats went into the ground in late March and early April. Here barley followed in April and into May. The work of sowing was done by hand, broadcasting seed from a cloth sling carried over the shoulder. Children and older family members walked behind to scare off the rooks and jackdaws that came for the seed. Summer brought the town its busiest weeks. The fishing was at its most productive, the fields were growing, and there was work for everyone. Longer days meant more hours of labor, and the pace of life in the town quickened noticeably from June onward. Merchants and traders arrived more frequently at the harbor. Goods moved in and out. The smell of fish, salt, and wood smoke was heaviest in August, when the herring were being processed on the beach, and the stacks of drying peat were being broken down and carried into stores. Autumn was the time of gathering in. The grain harvest in East Lothian came in August and September, earlier than in the upland parts of Scotland. The oats and barley were cut with sickles and bound into sheaves. They were stooked in the fields to dry and then carried to the threshing floor. The work was communal. Neighbors helped neighbors, and the obligation to help was understood by everyone. By October, the grain was stored, the cattle were being drawn back from the summer pastures, and the herring fishery was ending. The nights grew longer quickly in October on this coast. By the third week of the month, darkness came before 5 in the evening. The harbor was quiet by then, the boats pulled high on the beach, the pier empty. The Bass Rock was visible on clear nights as a pale shape in the darkness offshore. Its gannets settled for the season. The Firth moved in the darkness beyond the town, cold and wide and unlit, as it had been when the first houses were built at this narrow strip of land above the shore, and as it would continue to be long after the rooftops of 1590 had fallen to ruin and been replaced by something else entirely. The last light of an October evening falls low across the Firth of Forth. It comes in flat and pale from the west, catching the grey surface of the water and turning it briefly silver. The Bass Rock stands a mile offshore, dark and steep, its gannets already settled for the night. The boats are back. They were pulled up the shingle beach by late afternoon, 4 or 5 of them, small open craft used for line fishing in the inshore waters. The men who work them are not wealthy men. They live in low stone cottages close to the shore, and their walls smell of salt and fish oil and peat smoke. The harbour itself is modest. In 1590, North Berwick is a small royal borough, a fishing town of perhaps 400 or 500 souls. The harbour wall is built of rough stone, not quite high enough to shelter the boats in a hard northerly blow. The fishermen know its limitations. They have always known them. The nets that were used this morning are hung out on wooden stakes behind the cottages. Some of the men are still working them now in the last of the light, picking out knots and small tiers with fingers that are hardened from years of this work. They do not hurry. There is no reason to hurry. The light will last another quarter of an hour, and the work takes as long as it takes. A woman comes to a doorway on the eastern side of the town. She is carrying a wooden bucket. She sets it down beside the door and goes back inside. From the open door, a thread of smoke lifts and bends in the sea wind. The smell of it is peat, the deep earthy smell that every fire in the town produces. Coal is available at this time, brought by sea from the Fife coast, but many households in North Berwick still depend on peat cut from the land to the south. It is cheap. It burns slowly. It suits the long evenings. The meal being prepared in most households this evening is simple. A pot hangs over the fire on an iron chain or rests on a trivet above the embers. In a fishing town, there is almost always fish of some kind. Haddock is the most common catch in these waters. It might be salted, or it might be fresh from today's haul, boiled in water with whatever vegetables are to hand. Kale is the most reliable of those vegetables in East Lothian in autumn. It grows close to the ground and survives the coastal wind. It has a bitter, mineral taste. It is eaten every day by almost everyone. Oat bread is baked on a flat iron griddle and set beside the fire to stay warm. Oatmeal is the staple here, as it is across most of Scotland at this time. It appears as porridge in the morning, as flat cakes in the evening, as a thickener in broths. A household that has oatmeal has enough. A household that does not is in serious difficulty. The women and older children have been busy since late afternoon. They carry water from the well near the center of the borough. They manage the fire, which must not go out entirely, because relighting it is slow work with flint and steel. They turn the fish in the pot. They keep the younger children from the hearth. The hearth is in the middle of the floor in some of the older houses, the smoke finding its way out through a hole in the thatch above. In the newer buildings along the main street, there are proper chimney stacks of stone. The town has a market cross, which stands near the center of the borough. By this time of the evening, the market day business is long finished. A few people pass through the space beside it, going home or going to the harbour for a last look at the boats. A man stops and talks to another man for a moment. Their conversation is in Scots, the everyday language of this part of Scotland in 1590. English is the language of legal documents and church sermons. In the street, no one speaks it. The church of North Berwick is St. Andrew's, a collegiate church that sits on a small headland at the western edge of the town. Its stonework is old. Parts of it were built in the 12th century. By 1590, the Reformation has been in place in Scotland for 30 years, and the interior of the church has been stripped of its altars and images as required by the Reformed Kirk. But the building itself still stands. Its walls block the wind on the headland. The kirkyard around it holds the grave of generations of fishing families, the same surnames appearing again and again on the stones. There is a priory connected to the church, a Cistercian nunnery that was established in the 12th century. By 1590, it is effectively dissolved. The buildings are still partially standing, but no longer in use as a religious house. The stone of some of its outbuildings has been taken for other purposes over the decades. This is common. Dissolved religious houses across Scotland lost their materials slowly to the practical needs of the towns around them. The main street of the town runs roughly north to south, from the harbour end up to the market area and beyond. The buildings along it are mostly 2 stories. They are built of rubble stone with lime mortar, whitewashed in places, dark where the lime has worn away. Their roofs are thatched with straw or rushes, though some of the better houses have stone slates. The windows are small and unglazed in most of the properties, covered with wooden shutters that are pulled closed now against the evening chill. A candle appears in one of those windows, its light moving behind the shutter. Tallow candles are the most common source of artificial light. They are made from rendered animal fat, and they produce a smoky, unsteady flame. Beeswax candles are cleaner and brighter, but they are expensive and reserved for churches and the houses of wealthier people. A chandler operates in the borough, making and selling tallow candles. This is a practical trade in a town of this size. The trades of North Berwick in 1590 are limited but sufficient for the town's needs. There are fishermen, as there have always been. There are farmers working the land to the south and west of the borough. There is a miller using a grain mill on one of the small burns that run down to the sea. There are craftsmen, a blacksmith, a cobbler, a weaver. There is an alehouse, or very probably more than one. The borough has a toll booth, a small building that serves as both a courthouse and a place of counsel for the borough's affairs. The provost and bailies of the borough are the men who manage its day-to-day governance. In a small town like this, they are also the wealthier merchants and landowners who live in the better houses on the main street. Their houses are not grand, but they have more rooms than the fishermen's cottages. They might have a separate hall and a separate sleeping chamber. They might have a wooden bed with a straw mattress and a wool blanket. They might have pewter plates rather than wooden ones. The farmers who work the land around the borough are coming in now from the fields. October is the tail end of the harvest season. The main cereals grown in East Lothian at this time are oats and bearer, an older variety of barley. The harvest has been long and physical. It is done by hand, with sickles, by men, women, and older children working together. The cut grain is brought in on wooden sleds or in wicker baskets and stored in the barns that stand close to the farmhouses. East Lothian in 1590 is already known as fertile ground. The soil in this part of Scotland is heavier and richer than in the upland areas to the south and west. But the farming methods are still those of the runrig system, where strips of land are worked by different tenants on the same open field, and the animals are grazed on the common land between the settlement and the coast. The landscape around North Berwick is open and relatively treeless close to the sea, shaped by centuries of wind and salt air and grazing. A cart moves slowly along the track that comes in from the west. The ox pulling it is in no hurry. The carter is in no hurry either. He is bringing the last load of cut straw from a field outside the borough boundary. The wheels of the cart are solid wood, without iron rims. They leave deep ruts in the soft track. It has rained earlier in the week, and the ground has not fully dried. The light is almost entirely gone now. The sky to the west still holds a thin line of colour, a low amber above the dark horizon of the land. To the north, above the firth, the sky is already dark, and the first stars are appearing. The Bass Rock is invisible now, just a darker shape against the dark water. Inside the cottages, the fire is the only light. The family gathers close to it. In a small cottage of one room, this means sitting within a few feet of the hearth, on stools or on the floor. The warmth is important. October nights on the Firth of Forth are cold. The walls of the cottage are thick, but the door fits poorly and the shuttered window gaps let in the wind. A dog lies near the fire. Dogs are useful here, kept for herding and for keeping rats from the grain stores. The meal is eaten from wooden bowls. Spoons are wooden too, carved from a single piece of local timber. A knife is a personal possession, carried by men and used for eating as well as for work. Forks are not in common use in a household of this kind at this time. The bread is torn with the hands. The fish is broken apart with the fingers or the knife. The kale broth is drunk from the bowl when the solid pieces are gone. The conversation at this hour is not recorded, but the subjects of it can be understood from what is known about the life of the town, the quality of the day's catch, the state of the stored grain, the approach of winter and whether the peat stack is deep enough, the health of a child, the price of salt at the market, the business of the borough carried to the cottages by word of mouth along the street. There is also, in 1590, a particular tension in the air of North Berwick that has nothing to do with the ordinary business of fish and grain. The town is about to become known across Scotland and beyond for a set of events that will have consequences for the borough and for many of the people living in it. The great witch trials that will be examined by King James VI himself are beginning to take shape. Accusations have been made. Names have been spoken. The machinery of Scottish law and Scottish theology is beginning to turn. But on this particular evening, most of the people finishing their meals beside their fires do not yet know how close the storm is. The alehouse near the market cross still has a few men in it. The fire there is larger than the domestic fires up the street. The room is low-ceilinged and dark. Ale is brewed locally from malt barley, and it is weak by modern standards, but it is warm and it fills the stomach. The men sitting in the alehouse are talking quietly. One of them is a fisherman who has been at sea since before first light. Another is a craftsman who has finished the day's work in his workshop and has no particular reason to go home just yet. The sound of the sea is always present in North Berwick. It is not loud on a calm evening, but it is constant. The small waves on the shingle beach produce a slow, even sound, the water pulling back through the stones and then lifting forward again. Further out, past the harbour wall, the water moves in longer, heavier swells coming down the firth from the open North Sea. Seabirds call occasionally from the darkness above the water. A curlew passes over the town. The last fishing boats have been pulled above the tide line. The men who dragged them up the sand are already indoors. The beach at North Berwick lies empty now, the wet sand dark and flat under a sky that offers very little light. It is late October. The days have been shortening for weeks. By 5 in the afternoon, the light was already thin, and by 6 it was gone entirely. There are no gas lamps here. That technology is nearly 3 centuries away. The town sits in its own darkness, broken only in small ways. A tallow candle burns in one window on the high street. The flame is steady tonight because the wind has dropped. Tallow comes from rendered animal fat, and it gives off a faint, greasy smell that carries even through a closed shutter. Most households have already put their candles out. Candles cost money. Sleep is free. The high street itself is narrow. It runs roughly east to west, not far from the shore. The buildings along it are low and mostly timber-framed, with some stone construction closer to the kirk. The street surface is unpaved. It is compacted earth and sand, mixed with whatever has fallen from horses and carts throughout the day. By night it is invisible. A man who does not know the ground would stumble on it. The kirk of St. Andrew stands at the east end of the town. It has stood in various forms since the 12th century. By 1590, the building is post-Reformation, stripped of much of its Catholic ornamentation. The stone walls are thick. The windows are small and dark. No candle burns inside it tonight. The building is simply a mass of shadow against the slightly lighter sky. Out on the water, there is almost nothing to see. The Firth of Forth stretches north toward Fife. The Bass Rock sits roughly 2 miles offshore to the east. On a clear night, its pale volcanic bulk is just visible as a darker shape against the water. Tonight there may be cloud. The Bass Rock in 1590 is not yet a prison. It is home to a colony of gannets, though the gannets themselves are quiet now, settled into their roosts on the sheer faces of the rock. The sound from the sea is constant and low. A small swell is moving in from the northeast. It reaches the beach in a slow, repeated wash. The boats on the sand shift slightly as the backwash pulls gravel beneath them. Their hulls are clinker-built, overlapping planks of oak, tarred on the outside. They creak once, then are still. North Berwick in 1590 is a small borough. Its population is somewhere in the hundreds. The town received its royal borough charter in 1373, and it has grown slowly since then. There is a harbour at the north end of the settlement, just a short stone pier extending into the Firth. The pier is old and in regular need of repair. At this hour, the harbour is empty of movement. The water inside it laps quietly against the stone. A dog is awake somewhere near the market cross. It is not barking. It is moving along the base of a building, nose down, following something it found in the dark. The market cross stands near the middle of the borough. By day it is where small transactions happen, where fish is sold, where news passes from one person to another. Tonight the cross is just a stone post in the darkness. Most people in this town are asleep by now. The working day began before first light. The fishing crews were on the water by 4 in the morning, handling lines and nets in the cold of the Firth. The women who gutted and salted the catch worked through the morning and into the afternoon. Their hands smell of herring even after washing. They have been in their beds for an hour already. The bedding in most households is straw or dried bracken packed into a sack. It is changed when it begins to smell too strongly, which in a good household might be every few weeks. Some families sleep together for warmth. The nights in late October on the East Lothian coast are cold and damp. The temperature at this hour is perhaps 4 or 5 degrees above freezing. The wind earlier in the week carried rain off the Firth, and the walls of the lower houses are still damp at the base. Peat is the fuel here. Coal from the mines further along the Lothian coast is available but expensive for ordinary households. Peat cuts well in the boggy ground a mile or 2 inland. It burns slowly and gives off a dark, heavy smoke. In many houses, the fire has been banked for the night, the remaining embers covered with ash to hold them until morning. The smell of peat smoke sits over the town. It is faint now, just present in the cold air, distinguishable from nothing else. A few of the larger households keep cattle close to the buildings. The animals provide warmth and their presence is practical. A cow in a small attached byre raises the temperature of the adjacent room by several degrees. The cattle are quiet now. One of them shifts its weight, and the wooden partition between the byre and the house wall makes a slow, low sound. Then nothing. The ground behind the houses on the high street runs down to small plots of cultivated land. Kale is growing in several of them. Kale is the most reliable winter vegetable in East Lothian at this time. It survives frost. By November, it will be the main green food available in most houses. The stalks are thick and the leaves are dark, almost black in this light. They are invisible now, but they are there. Further south, beyond the borough boundary, the land is open and farmed. The fields around North Berwick in 1590 are worked on the run rig system. Long strips of land are ploughed in ridges, with drainage channels between them. The ploughing for the winter fallow is already done on most holdings. The ridges run roughly north to south and catch what little drainage the flat land allows. At night, the ridged fields are barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness. The plough teams use oxen more than horses in this part of Lothian. The oxen are heavier animals and turn the clay-mixed soils more effectively. They are pennied now, several of them together in a field enclosure near the south road out of the borough. They are breathing slowly. Their breath in the cold air would be visible if there were any light to show it. There is a mill on the Lochbridge Road, driven by a small burn that comes down from the higher ground to the south. The mill has been silent since late afternoon. The millstone is a heavy disc of dressed stone imported originally from quarries in France. That stone does not move at night. The burn runs on past the mill and continues toward the harbour, and its sound is constant, a small steady sound in the silence of the town. The women who bake bread in North Berwick use barley more than wheat. Wheat is grown in Lothian, but barley is more common and more forgiving. A barley loaf is dense and slightly grey. It is baked in the morning when the fire is at its hottest. By evening, the loaf is a day old or 2 days old. It is still edible. It is the main carbohydrate in most households, alongside pottage made from whatever is available. Tonight, the bread that was baked this morning is already gone. On the high street, one building is slightly larger than its neighbours. It is likely the house of a merchant, possibly a man involved in the export trade that passes through the harbour. North Berwick exports salt fish, grain and wool along the coast, and sometimes to the Low Countries. The merchant's house has 2 stories. The upper story is timber-framed on a stone ground floor. A single light was burning in the upper room an hour ago. It is out now. The church land near the old priory site at the east of the borough is quiet. The Cistercian nunnery that stood near the shore was dissolved in the years of the Reformation. By 1590, the buildings are partly ruinous, partly repurposed. Some of the stone has been taken for other construction. Grass grows where the cloister once stood. At night, the remaining walls are low shapes in the ground, easily missed. A cart has been left in the road near the harbour. It belongs to someone who moved fish from the shore to the curing house earlier in the day. The cart is empty now. Its 2 wooden wheels are sitting at a slight angle where they found a rut in the road. The axle is wooden and needs greasing. That is a job for tomorrow morning. The North Berwick Law rises behind the town to the south. It is a volcanic plug, a cone of hard basalt standing about 187 meters above sea level. On a clear day, the law is visible from miles away across the Forth. At night, it is simply an absence of stars in the southern sky, a dark shape where the horizon should be. There is nothing on its summit tonight. Cattle graze its lower slopes by day. They are not there now. Somewhere near the shore, a seal is hauled out on the flat rocks beyond the harbour. Grey seals are common on this stretch of coast. The seal is lying still, breathing in the slow rhythm of a sleeping animal. Its weight on the rock is considerable. It does not move. The tide is going out, and the rock shelf it chose is getting broader, which suits it. The town constable, if there is one on watch tonight, is likely standing close to a building for shelter. The October wind off the firth is damp and penetrating. He would be wearing a heavy woolen cloak, possibly with a hood. His shoes would be leather, not well waterproofed. His feet would be cold. He would be counting the time until he could go indoors. The sky above North Berwick, on a night when the cloud breaks, shows a great deal. There is no competing light from the town. A clear night in late October here would show the Milky Way as a wide, dense band. The constellation of Orion is rising in the southeast by midnight. The fishermen know these stars practically. They navigate by them when they work the firth on early mornings before the light comes. Tonight the men who know those stars are asleep. The cold is deepening now. The temperature is dropping toward the small hours. The damp that came in off the firth earlier in the evening is settling as a thin frost on the exposed surfaces. The upturned hull of a small boat on the beach is already showing it. The tar between the planks is stiffening slightly in the cold. By morning, the boat will have a white glaze on its upper surface, and the men who come to launch it will be in no hurry to touch the wet wood with bare hands. Inside the houses, the sleeping continues. The peat under its layer of ash still holds a small heat. The cattle in their byres are. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. The story is finished, but the night isn't, so let this play on as long as it helps. If Tartan Lullaby has been good company, you're welcome to subscribe so the next story finds you. There's no rush. If you'd like to see the landscapes that go with these stories, the art prints are at Tartan Lullaby Art on Etsy, with mood boards and stills on Pinterest under the same name. The links are in the description below. Until next time, thank you for listening. Sleep well, all is well.